Good day. Fighting continues as I am making this program in the Gaza Strip between Israeli forces and Hamas, and as of yesterday in the United Nations, both the Security Council and the UN General Assembly continued with their emergency sessions with various reports from their officials, from UN officials, about the overall situation in Gaza, and with more demands from the US Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, for an immediate ceasefire. I'm not going to discuss these meetings in any detail. We saw just a few days ago on Friday, the General Assembly passed its first resolution calling for a ceasefire. As I said, there's going to be more meetings, more statements from various representatives around the world. There's, so far as I'm aware, been no further attempt to present a further resolution to the UN Security Council. But I suspect that we will start to see moves to that effect begin to emerge, perhaps towards the end of this week, or perhaps towards the start of next week, depending on the evolution of the situation on the ground. One thing I did note, and with interest, was that the Office for the Coordination, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, briefed the Security Council yesterday, not just about the situation in the Middle East, but also about the situation in Ukraine, and reported to the UN Security Council that over the course of the period of the special military operation, which is now approaching its second year, it began in February 2022, and we are now in November 2023, that over the course of the entire period of the special military operation, around 9,900 civilians have been killed. Now that is over the course of almost 2 years of fighting. Now, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs made clear to the UN Security Council that this was an estimate. There's every reason to think that the actual casualty toll has been higher, but probably not orders of magnitude higher. Now, the contrast with the situation in Gaza must be one that will have been noted by the delegates of the Security Council, the ambassadors of the Security Council, and there's no doubt that this report is being circulated across the General Assembly, and it's almost certainly been noted there amongst the people, amongst the representatives of the various UN member states in the General Assembly. Now, again, we are to some extent reliant here about information from the Gaza Ministry of Health. I don't place huge reliance upon these figures, but I've noticed that UN agencies are also saying that around 9,000 civilians have died in Gaza over the course of the fighting of the last month or so, the last 3 weeks. Now, perhaps that is an overestimate, but on its face, the UN Security Council, and by extension the General Assembly, have been told that as many people have died as a result of principally Israeli bombing in Gaza within a period of 3 weeks, as have died over the course of, well, almost 2 months, 2 years of fighting in Ukraine. Civilians, I'm talking specifically about civilian deaths. Now, I don't want to push these comparisons too far. These are very different conflicts, and one can understand, perhaps, why casualty rates in Gaza would be higher than casualty rates in Ukraine. And of course, and it's absolutely proper to say, that these casualty rates among civilians in Gaza should not cause people to forget or overlook the fact that the conflict in Gaza began following an attack on southern Israel by Hamas, which is now acknowledged to have caused around 1,400 civilian deaths, also a very high total. But inevitably, there are going to be people in the General Assembly and in the Security Council, ambassadors, diplomats, who are saying to each other and who are spreading amongst each other the observation that Israel is killing as many civilians in 3 weeks as Russia has killed in almost 2 years of intense fighting, and Western governments, specifically the government of the United States, which has been extremely critical of the actions of Russia in Ukraine, seems to be much less critical of the actions of Israel in Gaza. One can push back against that. One can say that these comparisons are inappropriate and wrong, but people will make them, and they will have a political effect, and it is likely that that political effect will be spreading across the Middle East, across the Islamic world, across the global community, the entity, the group of states referred to by many people as the Global South, but perhaps which more appropriately ought to be referred to instead as the global majority. And that is something which Western leaders, Western governments, first and foremost the government of the United States, ought to be taking into account. So we are in that situation where, as I said, intense fighting in the Gaza Strip, civilians undoubtedly dying in large numbers. One doesn't have to accept definitively any of the figures that have been given, but that civilians are dying in large numbers. Well, the evidence for that seems to be compelling, and almost certainly moves before long, again, in the Security Council and the General Assembly for resolutions demanding a ceasefire. And it's important to say that when the proposals for a ceasefire are put to the Security Council and or to the General Assembly, they will of course reference back that earlier resolution that the General Assembly passed on Friday, and which did of course call for a ceasefire. So we will see that the pressure will slowly build and accumulate and will grow. And of course already people around the world are commenting about the fact that the General Assembly has passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire, and Israel is opposing it and disregarding it, and so is the United States, and so to a great extent are the other leading Western powers. And again, for the moment, that is a containable problem. UN General Assembly resolutions are advisory, not binding, unless they're passed under the Uniting for Peace formula. And for the moment, the political damage, the diplomatic damage, is containable. But with every iteration of this, the pressure is inevitably going to increase, and we're going to inevitably see a peeling off of support in Europe amongst those global south countries which continue to abstain on resolutions like this, and of course within the countries, the major Western countries themselves. So already apparently we see that the Republican Party in Congress, the House Republicans, now led by Speaker Johnson, are, according to an article I've just read on The Hill, starting to craft their funding resolutions. They're separating from funding resolutions, funding for Ukraine and funding for Israel. They're pressing forward with a package that will include funding for Israel, but also apparently cuts to the IRS, which is intended to make it more difficult for Democrats to support this funding package, enabling House Republicans, led by Speaker Johnson, to say that the Democrats are holding up financial support for Israel, which House Republicans believe will play well for their Republican base. The point is that the House Republicans, again, according to this article in The Hill, are also calculating that by pressing for emergency funding to be provided to Israel, $14 billion, and separating the question of funding for Ukraine from that package, they're also seeking to highlight and expose divisions that are starting to appear within the Democratic Party on this question. So, for the first time, there are within the Democratic Party people who oppose funding to Israel. There's apparently a Palestinian congresswoman, the first one, who is there. She's come in for a great deal of criticism recently and demands that she should be, I understand, disciplined in some way. I'm not going to discuss that aspect of domestic US internal politics. But it's likely that there will be some Democrats, perhaps not many, perhaps a dozen or a score, who will perhaps vote against this package of aid for Israel, exposing party divisions on this, which will work to the advantage of the Republicans. But of course, the key point, the one to bear in mind, that these cracks which are starting to appear in terms of political support for Israel in Congress are unprecedented. They have never happened in my lifetime. And they're starting to reflect a sea change of opinion on this issue in the United States. Whereas once support for Israel was pretty much universal and unqualified in the United States, it appears to be significantly less so today, and the longer this conflict continues, the greater those cracks will be. And similar cracks, by the way, are emerging in Britain within the British Labour Party, with the British Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, finding himself at odds with many members of his party, including of his shadow cabinet, because of his general support of British and US policy over this conflict. This is perhaps of less significance, given that the Labour Party is in opposition and not in government. But apparently there have been large protests in Britain against British support for the United States and for Israel, and opposition to a ceasefire. And I understand that opinion polling in Britain shows very strong support indeed, 76% support amongst British people who have been polled on this issue, strong support amongst them for a ceasefire. And every British government, every British political leader, Labour and Conservative, of course, knows the political dangers of appearing to be at odds with British public opinion on this issue. The experience of the Iraq War, where the British government, led by Tony Blair, ignored, or rather overrode protests in the streets against the war and in Parliament, leading to, and this must be said, leading to the eventual collapse of his political position and his forced resignation and retirement from British politics. Every British political leader, Keir Starmer, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, all of these people understand the enormous risks they're taking if they go down Blair's route and events on the ground turn out badly, as they did for Blair back when he was Prime Minister. So this is going to create fragility and nervousness in Britain as well, and I'm sure that the same is true in other European countries, West European countries principally, as well. So political diplomatic pressure continues, pressure within countries continues. The longer this war continues, the greater that pressure will be, and the likelihood is, as I said, that we're going to see another Security Council proposed resolution before long, perhaps another resolution from the General Assembly. Each one of these resolutions using stronger language than the one before, and each one of these resolutions gradually accumulating more support the longer this crisis drags on and the more the news from Gaza remains as it is. Now, all of this, as I have said many times, will to a great extent now be dictated by events on the ground. And here I'm going to say straight away that I'm getting completely conflicting opinions about what is happening on the ground. Now, one set of opinions provided to me by several people, most of whom have military backgrounds, which are being communicated to me privately, have assessed the information that's coming out from the conflict zone and feel that Israel, the Israeli forces, are definitely gaining the upper hand, that the situation appears to be moving very much in Israel's direction, though none of them provide a timeline for how long they think this operation will take, and the operation does indeed appear to be very much in its early stages, and as I've discussed in recent programs, its overall objectives appear to have been scaled down from what they were at the commencement. A different set of views, perhaps from people who, to be frank, I know less or less about, and some of which I've noticed have also been expressed publicly, take the diametrically opposite view. They say that the Israeli operation in Gaza is not going well, that Israel has not managed to gain any significant ground, and that the attempts, the original phase 1 that Israel announced, which was apparently some sort of reconnaissance in force, resulted in very heavy losses, and that there have been further heavy Israeli losses since, and there are claims that there are pictures of burning or knocked out Merkava tanks and armoured vehicles and things like that. Now, I have to say, I'm going to say this straight away, I think these reports are less reliable than the other reports that I've got which speak of Israeli success. One of the reasons I say that is because I'm not fully convinced that some of these pictures that are apparently circulating of knocked out Merkava tanks are not pictures of knocked out Merkava tanks which we have already seen before. Now, I'm not the best person to assess and analyse photographs, not by any stretch, so I might be entirely wrong about that. That's the first thing. The second is I know much less about the people who are making these claims, and that makes it more difficult for me to assess them. And the third concern I have is that it does seem to me that at least one of these reports appears to be drawing information from Iranian sources, from what has been published in the Iranian media. Now, I'm not by any means saying that what the Iranian media says about this conflict, about the fighting, about the progress of the fighting, is necessarily wrong or should be assumed to be so. On the contrary, I would say that I can remember that at the height of the Syrian conflict in 2016, 2017, a lot of the most interesting and accurate and reliable reports about the conflict that I was reading at that time actually came from Iranian news agencies. But there has been one piece of information that has come from Iranian news agencies on this occasion, which has been categorically denied and which does appear to be wrong. And that is that some Iranian sources have apparently claimed that there have been US special forces participating in the operation in Gaza. The Pentagon has absolutely categorically denied this. I think that the strength of the Pentagon's denial on this occasion leads me to think that that denial is probably correct, in which case, by extension, this information from this Iranian source is wrong, in which case, by further extension, that must make one worry about the reliability of more of this information that we're getting, not just from this particular Iranian source, but perhaps, just possibly, from other ones as well. This is a conflict about which people care very much about. Emotions are very strong, and it's perhaps not surprising that people who write about this conflict from various perspectives and who are emotionally engaged in it are reporting things perhaps in advance of what has happened, or perhaps pick up stray rumours and assume that they are true because those rumours fit in very well with their overall conception of what they think must be happening. Now, I've said that I think on balance, those people who say that the Israelis are definitely getting the upper hand, I lean towards thinking that they are rather more reliable. But I would come back and say this: even if one assumes that to be the case, and so far it is only an assumption, as far from my point of view, it is only an assumption. We don't get very much information from the battle lines. We are still not being provided with anything that remotely looks like a timeline, or even a clear explanation from Israel of how it expects to achieve victory. Now, again, I'm probably going against what some of the people whom I've previously mentioned have been writing to me. They say that Israel does have a plan, They've discussed the nature of the plan and how it's working out. But I have to say, reading what they say, I feel that, again, they're to some extent applying their own knowledge of what infantry and military tactics should be to try to second guess what the Israelis are doing. And to some extent, at least, they seem to be taking various statements by Israeli officials and putting them together with their own analysis of what the Israelis ought to do, and assuming that the Israelis are indeed following the plan that they assume it is following. And I have to say, again, I am not convinced of this. I haven't seen any real explanation from the Israelis of how they imagine this operation to end in a way that would amount to something that the Israelis could call victory, and nor have they provided anything that remotely resembles like a clear timeline. Now, just a few days ago, about a week ago, I remember the Israeli defense minister saying that he expected the operation in Gaza to last 3 months, which is already, by the way, a very long time in political terms. But, of course, there have been other reports which say that it's going to be much longer than that it could last a year or even more. And apparently there's no clear plan about what to do once Hamas supposedly has been defeated, if it can be defeated. There are now reports that the United States and Israel are talking about establishing a peacekeeping force in Gaza. But where would that peacekeeping force come from? The Arab states? The United Nations? It's difficult to see at the moment that Israel would be able to work with the United Nations. And would the Arab states really be keen to send troops into Gaza, absent some kind of further move towards a political settlement? From the European countries, would the Europeans really want to send their people into Gaza? From the United States, I would say, by the way, that in my opinion, that is a non-starter. I think Americans would be deeply opposed to US troops being deployed to Gaza. I get the overwhelming sense that US military commitments to these kind of operations have become deeply unpopular in the United States. So where would this peacekeeping force come from? And of course, if the purpose of the peacekeeping force comes to be seen around the world as doing America's and Israel's job in Gaza, then it's very easy to see how it could be represented to the world amongst the Palestinian community and amongst perhaps the people of Gaza, not actually as a peacekeeping force, but as an occupation force. Let me reiterate again a point that I have made many times. When Clausewitz famously said that war is an extension of politics, what he was actually expressing was something that is completely obvious. It is so obvious that it is almost a cliche. That doesn't, of course, make it untrue. Any war, in order to be successful, requires some kind of political plan, some kind of political understanding of what it is you are working towards achieving. And for the moment, I have seen no evidence either that Israel or the United States actually have one. Now, criticism is also growing, and it is not just growing amongst the kind of people that I've been talking about, the people who go out and protest in the streets, often in very big numbers in Britain, the people who are on the radical wing of the Democratic Party, those sort of people. If protest were confined to them, well, it would still be a political problem. But it is not just confined to them. There's been, for example, a series of articles in the Financial Times, a newspaper which, as I've said previously, is very close politically to the Biden administration, but which seems this time to be extremely concerned about the policies that the Biden administration is taking. And this one article, which is by Edward Luce, is making a point which I have made before, which is that President Biden made a huge mistake when he went to Israel and appeared to give Prime Minister Netanyahu a carte blanche. By doing that, and that was certainly the public optics, whatever might have been said in private, he has not only offended and to a great extent alienated opinion across the Arab world, but he has now attached himself politically to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is left making all the decisions. And we have comments like this. He says that this is the article, as I said, to come back, this is the article by Edward Luce. Biden has reiterated that America's goal remains the two-state solution, on the theory that it is darkest before dawn. Hamas's barbaric slaughter and Israel's retaliatory actions have reinforced the case that only a Palestinian state can guarantee Israel's security. The alternatives, a binational secular state or the status quo, can respectively be dismissed as fantasy and unacceptable. Yet Netanyahu's life work has been focused upon making the two-state solution impossible. And then Edward Luce makes all kinds of observations about Prime Minister Netanyahu, whom he clearly doesn't like, which I'm going to skip. And he then goes on, however, to make some, I think, pertinent points. Israel's military plan to remove Hamas has to be linked to the political settlement that will come afterwards. Netanyahu stands in the way of Biden's two-state goal. Assuming it is feasible, can eliminating Hamas be done in a way to increase Palestinian support for a non-violent alternative? Who will administer Gaza? The likelihood is that Israel's levelling of parts of Gaza, pressuring East Egypt and other Arab states to take its 2.2 million people as refugees, and then retreating behind a more fortified garrison, will only increase Palestinian support for extremism. Israel's next battlefront would then be the West Bank. This is where Biden's approach could turn to disaster. Unless he can pressure Netanyahu into an improbable change of heart, Israel is set to proceed with what will look to the world like collective punishment. And we saw yesterday in the program that I did yesterday that President Putin of Russia is already talking about Israeli actions looking like collective punishment of the people of Gaza for the actions which were taken by Hamas, which is of course contrary to international humanitarian and war crimes law. And of course that view has also been expressed by the UN Secretariat and by other UN officials, one of whom, by the way, has now resigned in protest against Israeli policy. And of course it has also been taken up by many countries and many political leaders around the world. And Luce says that that's how it will look, even if Israel takes every precaution to minimize civilian deaths. Biden will be held responsible. And he goes on to say that it's perhaps understandable, the nature of the policy that Biden has taken is perhaps understandable, but it doesn't make it wise. This is Luce's words. Like a good lawyer, Biden needs to control his witness, yet Netanyahu answers to nobody but himself. While Netanyahu remains, Biden's presidency is hostage to a man who will never repay the favour. Now note that Edward Luce, I don't know whom he's spoken to, but he has always struck me as a well-connected person, somebody who does reflect a feeling within at least part of the British establishment, and perhaps I should say the Anglo-American establishment, is here quite obviously hinting at the need to remove Prime Minister Netanyahu from his position as Prime Minister of Israel. But anyway, note again his point that the risk the United States is running, the risk that President Biden is running, the risk the administration is running, is that they've now attached themselves to Netanyahu, to the policy that Israel is pursuing, and if it all goes wrong, the United States will be blamed, and so will President Biden himself. And that is one article which has appeared in the Financial Times. There is another article as well, and this is also in the Financial Times, and this article, written by a former British diplomat who was at the British Foreign Ministry desk before the at the time of the 1982 Lebanon War. Anyway, in some ways that is even more critical, and it is taking a line that could be said to be a warning to Israel. Now, this particular article refers specifically to what happened in 1982, and it discusses the eventual failure of Israel's Lebanon policies. And the point that it makes, and it is surely a valid one, is that in 1982, following the assassination of the Israeli ambassador, I believe it was the ambassador to London, the Israeli government at that time, led by Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, decided that they would end the problem as they saw it of Palestinian Liberation Organization, which they assumed was behind that assassination, that they would end it once and for all. And the result was that they launched Operation Peace for Galilee. And this operation also appeared to begin well. And the result was that the PLO, which had become entrenched in southern Lebanon, in Beirut particularly, was rapidly defeated. And after an operation lasting a few weeks, the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, were forced to leave Lebanon and to relocate in Tunis, far away, Tunisia. And the article goes on to say, for a brief moment, Sharon seemed to have achieved a remarkable victory. Then it all went wrong. And it describes how world opinion, including, by the way, opinion in Israel, was shocked by massacres that were carried out by allies, Christian allies of Israel, a Christian militia in Israel, in Lebanon rather. Now, I should make it clear, a Lebanese Christian militia in Lebanon, but who were allied to Israel. A massacre that they carried out of Palestinian civilians in Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, how Israel then found itself in all sorts of complex military operations facing various Shia militias in southern Lebanon, how the United States itself found that its attempt to insert itself into the conflict in Lebanon was working to its disadvantage, and then ultimately the result was, and again I quote from the article, which is by the way by Peter Ricketts, that the ultimate result was that this left, when Israel had to withdraw in 1985, a weak and unstable Lebanese government unable to prevent Syria tightening its grip on the country, or Hezbollah, with Iranian backing, establishing itself in the south. And what Peter Ricketts doesn't quite say, but which actually is the big takeaway for me from the events in Lebanon in the 1980s and thereafter, is that what Israel actually achieved was that it destroyed or defeated one organization, a Palestinian organization, the PLO, which was secular and left-wing and perhaps not particularly well organized and perhaps not particularly dangerous to Israel in Lebanon, and replaced it eventually with a far more powerful ally, more powerful and dangerous adversary, which is, of course, the Shia militia, Hezbollah, organized on a far bigger scale than the PLO in Lebanon ever was, and heavily equipped and backed by Iran. And it seems to me that something similar has happened within Palestine itself. Israeli actions, which continued thereafter to try to undermine the PLO, which eventually became the Palestinian Authority, have merely ended up, in Gaza at least, replacing a decayed and corrupt, and in some respects corrupt, organization, the PLO, which had never been successful in its various military operations against Israel, with a much, much more potent and dangerous adversary, which is, of course, Hamas. And again, how do we know that if Hamas is destroyed in Gaza, assuming that is even achievable or is achieved, how do we know that whatever replaces Hamas might not be more dangerous still? Unless there is some kind of political resolution to this problem, political solution to this problem. And it is this is the problem. This absence of a proper political solution is the one that I haven't seen any sign that Israel has so far developed. And this comes back also to this growing demand now from around the world for a peace conference to try to sort out the underlying problems in this whole conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. And Edward Luce, going back to him, is most probably correct when he says that Prime Minister Netanyahu himself is never really going to ever accept a two-state solution. And it could very well be that he speaks for more people in Israel than just himself, and for the Israeli government. But if Prime Minister Netanyahu is opposed to a two-state solution, or perhaps more pertinently, if Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't want to see an international peace conference set up to try and resolve the problem in the Middle East, well, what exactly is his alternative? What is his plan for a final resolution of this long-standing conflict? He's never articulated one, not that I have seen. He's pursued diplomatic relations with various Arab states. That has been successful up to a point, but it didn't prevent this attack by Hamas on southern Israel in 3 weeks ago. It didn't resolve the underlying problem on the West Bank. It doesn't seem to have ended Israel's long-term security problems. And I'm going to say that he probably made things worse and has made the atmosphere even more fraught by apparently attending a recent meeting of the UN General Assembly and showing a map of what he thought the situation should look like when peace was finally achieved. And apparently that map gave Israel the entire territory of the British Mandate of Palestine and didn't leave any space for a Palestinian state. Well, I haven't seen that map, so I haven't seen the pictures of that, so I don't know whether that is true. But if that is his objective, if that is indeed his long-term objective, then I'm going to simply say this. It seems to me that that is not any kind of achievable objective at all. And if it were achieved, my own personal view is that it would not make Israel's security problems better. It would make them worse, and it would, in fact, alienate even more people from Israel than has been the case up to this point. So, anyway, there we go. An absence of any clear political plan for the way forward. Now, having said all of this, people will no doubt ask me what I think perhaps should be done in these kind of situations. What alternative should the United States and Israel follow? I've said in previous programs on the Duran that I think that perhaps the more logical course, rather than starting a ground operation or looking immediately for a military solution, was to go to the Security Council, the UN Security Council, seek from the UN Security Council a resolution condemning the actions taken by Hamas as a terrorist act, requiring the immediate release of hostages, of all of the hostages, and also the calling on Hamas to surrender to Israel all of those involved in perpetrating the attack on the 7th of October, and perhaps referring their cases to the International Criminal Court. I'm confident that a resolution of that nature would have passed. The Russians, the Chinese, almost certainly would have supported it. Why wouldn't they? And of course, it is what the Security Council was set up to do. Now, Hamas almost certainly would have opposed, would have ignored such a resolution, would have defied it, but then a further resolution could have been proposed whereby the Security Council started to take measures against Hamas under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Again, I have no doubt that a resolution in that form would have passed, and that would have undoubtedly involved sanctions of Hamas, seizure of its property, confiscation of its assets, closure of its bank accounts, declaration of Hamas as a terrorist organization, that kind of thing, which would have had international legal force, unlike nearly all the sanctions that the United States imposes, and which the various Arab states would have been under intense pressure to comply with, and which probably they would have complied with. In fact, I'm confident that they would have done. And if that didn't work, a further action by the Security Council could have been taken, some of which might even have authorized Israel itself to take various steps, but more likely would have required further steps to be taken by the international community. Hamas would then have been, in effect, labelled not a political organisation, but a criminal terrorist one, and it would have been isolated. There would have been no question of political negotiations with it, which is what people talk about. And in my experience, an organisation that faces that kind of international pressure starts to crumble and disintegrate, splits within it start to grow, and eventually military and police action could instead have been taken. Well, that would have been a better course, in my opinion. It would not have resulted in these terrible headlines about which we've seen, about deaths in Gaza. It would have eventually led to the kind of political outcome that Israel would have wanted in terms of the end of Hamas, and it would have left Israel in a stronger position. As it is, instead, we have a war, we have these terrible headlines, we see the pressure in the Security Council and the General Assembly starting to build, and we see instead, and in addition, increasing talk about this international peace conference. So, what should the United States and Israel do now? Well, one has to say that we are in a different position from what the one we would have been in if the kind of steps that I've just outlined had been taken on the 7th of October or just after, in immediate response to that attack. But as I always say, if you're in a hole, stop digging. It's perhaps possible to start moving back onto that kind of track. So, perhaps go back to the Security Council, agree to a prolonged humanitarian pause. That was the language used in the General Assembly resolution of last Friday. So you can avoid use of the word ceasefire. You've already rejected it. So go for a prolonged humanitarian pause. Perhaps to make things easier for yourself, agree for a timeline, that it should last until a particular date. It might be up for renewal by the Security Council, that kind of thing. That's a fairly regular practice in terms of Security Council resolutions. Again, demand the release of the hostages, obtain a clear-cut condemnation of Hamas. Again, I suspect that in return for that prolonged humanitarian course, the Security Council, the key members of the Security Council, Russia and China would probably agree to that, call for the immediate surrender of the perpetrators of the events of 7th of October, and then try to get it all back on track and move towards the eventual Chapter 7 sanctions and all of those kind of things. But of course, restarting that process now inevitably is going to require the resignation of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has been making some extraordinary comments recently, resorting to eschatological language, which, just put it mildly, I think has been unhelpful. And by the way, his stepping down should not be that unpopular or difficult in Israel. Apparently, there's overwhelming feeling in Israel that he was partly responsible for what happened on the 7th of October. So arrange for Prime Minister Netanyahu to step down, as hinted at by Edward Luce, and then proceed down the road I've just outlined through the UN, and eventually, and in time, perhaps Israel should consider, if it doesn't want an international peace conference, that it should make some proposal, some meaningful proposal itself for how to resolve this long-standing problem that it has with the Palestinian people, the one that has never been up to now solved. Until Israel makes a proposal of its own for how to achieve a lasting peace in the Middle East, one between itself and the Palestinians, unless it does that, it must accept the fact that others will put forward proposals of their own, and they might not be proposals that Israel likes. Now, setting it all out in this way has to be made with the acknowledgement that none of this is going to happen. Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to step down. The Israeli government is not going to follow the course that I've said. The United States government is not going to support Israel or pressure Israel to pursue this course. As Alistair Crook has said undoubtedly correctly, all the facts point to war. War will follow. It is happening indeed as we speak. However, as I always do, I simply set out these options, these alternatives, because when and if it all turns out badly wrong, I don't want it to be said, or at least it will be said, but I don't want it to be said, or at least accepted, that no actual alternatives existed to the course that is being followed, the one that is going to lead to war. So there we go. I've set out my views. I don't expect that I will return to these political diplomatic issues for a while. I think all that now we can wait and see for is how this military campaign in Gaza shapes out, keeping our fingers crossed that an all-out Middle East war can be avoided. For the moment, as I said, the danger of that has abated a little, but we have to wait and see what happens when all the US military deployments in the Middle East have been completed. So, as I said, in the meantime, all we can do is to wait this one out and see what the eventual outcome of the military campaign will be. But to repeat again, and for the last time, at least on this program, if it all turns out wrong, if it ends badly, then don't come to me and say that there were no other options, no alternatives, because they were there for the taking. A decision was made not to take them, and we will be left then with a debacle that we are probably, in my opinion, heading towards, and there will be no excuses that certainly I will accept for that. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the conflict today. We will wait and see what happens in the General Assembly and in the Security Council. As I said, I strongly suspect that we will be getting more resolutions, more drafts of resolutions presented to the Security Council and to the General Assembly before very long. Anyway, what is happening elsewhere in the world? Well, fighting continues in Ukraine. The Daily Telegraph published an article of its own. It's sent teams of a reporting team along the Ukrainian front lines. They spoke to Ukrainian soldiers, and again, the same story. Deep frustration about the way in which the war is going, a growing sense that the war is not going well. The offensive has proved a failure. The Daily Telegraph doesn't use that word, but I can. And a reluctance to admit the scale of the failure, but it appears to be getting worse all the time. Now, I've discussed in various programs how the Russians appear to be increasingly successful in shooting down Ukrainian aircraft. I saw a report today that up to 4 Sukhoi 27 fighter jets have been shot down over a short period. And they are, of course, more powerful than the MiG-29s that Ukraine has and has been using. Much more powerful, much more complex aircraft than the MiG-29s. And they're in short supply, and importantly, they don't exist in Eastern Europe, and therefore there is no means to replace them. So more Ukrainian aircraft being shot down, apparently more missiles being shot down. There were, again, renewed attacks by Ukraine towards Crimea. Lots of cruise missiles launched by Ukraine towards Crimea. The Russians don't always tell us what these missiles consisted of. Storm Shadows, Scalps, the French equivalent of the Storm Shadow, perhaps ATACMS as well, perhaps some of these converted S-200 missiles that Ukraine has. S-200s are surface-to-air missiles from the 1960s, which Ukraine has converted into long-range missiles. Perhaps the Ukrainian Grom missiles, perhaps even some of the older Soviet missiles that Ukraine still apparently has. Anyway, lots of them. Apparently none of these missiles got through. On 2 attacks, one following upon the other, more of them lost. All of them lost. All of these missiles lost. None of them achieving anything. ATACMS missiles have been launched. The Russians are now increasingly successful, apparently, in shooting them down. The Russians don't make clear how they're shooting them down, but I'm going to suggest that the presence of the MiG-31s over the Black Sea with their powerful radars, the presence of the Beriev AWACS aircraft, A-50 AWACS aircraft, is probably also having an effect, is also making it easier for these aircraft, for these missiles to be shot down. So, lots bad news for Ukraine in terms of the air and missile war, with the Russians, of course, still able, by contrast, to launch attacks of their own against Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian bases, using drones, Uranium-2 drones, which are being regularly updated and churned out in enormous numbers by the Russians, and also the Russians continuing to launch missile strikes against Ukrainian bases. And of course, and we've also had now reports of Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister. He says that 25,000 specialists, as he called it, are now going to join and participate in the special military operation. It doesn't make clear what these specialists are supposed to do, that there's going to be 25,000 of them, apparently. I'm going to make a guess that quite a lot of these are probably drone operators. The Russians have been working very hard over the last year to train people into becoming drone operators. But note again the number, 25,000. The head of Rostec, which is the company that produces, rather brings together the various parts of the Russian military industrial complex. Anyway, he's been giving some figures for Russian weapons production. And he says, for example, that production of tanks has increased 7-fold. Now, I presume what he means by that is not just new tanks, but refurbished tanks are starting to appear in ever bigger numbers from the Russian military. But anyway, whatever, they are being produced in ever bigger quantities by the Russians. And he also speaks about big increases in armoured vehicle production. And, well, I will quote his words. Over the year, we increased the production of tanks by 7 times, light armoured vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles by 4.5 times, artillery, multiple rocket launch systems by 2.5 times, ammunition, some types of products by 60 times. So Ukraine having all of its problems, but it's in terms of replacing its weapons. I've discussed those at great length. But the point is that the Russians, according to Rostec, their military industries are cranking out weapons in enormous numbers. And we also are now seeing further discussions about Ukrainian losses. So David Axe at Forbes admits that Ukraine is losing more and more of its Leopard 2 tanks. He still gives numbers for Leopard 2 losses, which seem to me to be far too low based on the reports and pictures of Leopard 2 losses that I have seen. But anyway, he accepts that the ability of the West to continue to make up for these Leopard 2 losses is running down. He also acknowledges that the Leopard 1 tanks that are being supplied by Germany, relics from the Cold War, from the 1950s and 1960s, that they're not really up to the rigours of this conflict. The armour is too thin, the gun is too light. He says that in light of this, the Western powers are having again to take old Soviet-era T-72s back out of storage, refurbish them with new engines and new optics, and send those to Ukraine instead of the Leopard 2s. Now, T-72s come in many different forms. You can go to Jim Kinnair's various books about the T-72. He explains in enormous detail the history of this vehicle. And you can get a good sense of its potency and what it's designed for. But my understanding is that, contrary to what David Axe appears to think, there is not an infinite number of T-72s that can be brought out of storage, refurbished, provided with new engines and new optics, and which can then be sent off to Ukraine. Had that been the case, the West would have already supplied these T-72s. In fact, as I understand it, T-72s are there in significantly reduced numbers. Now, the numbers of T-72s that can be sent to Ukraine is also limited. So, there we go. And Ukraine continuing to suffer very heavy losses. Now, there's been a lot more information from the battlefronts. Information which, again, I'm perhaps not the best person to process. Firstly, it is clear now that it is the Russians who are attacking in every part of the front lines, except one, which is in Kherson region. In Kherson region, the Ukrainians managed to land apparently roughly a platoon worth of troops about 2 weeks ago on the eastern bank of the Dnieper, and these men, around 30 of them, still occupy some houses in the village of Krinky, and they are apparently able to obtain support from Ukrainian artillery on the west bank of the Dnieper, and Ukrainian drones are busy in this area. And so far, and for the moment, the Russians haven't been able to drive them back across the Dnieper, or indeed to perhaps capture and destroy this group. It's important to stress we're only talking about 30 men at the moment. Now, the Ukrainians have made apparently numerous other attempts to land other parties of men across the Dnieper, but up to this point, all of those other attempts have been unsuccessful. Now, the Russians have appointed a new commander in this area, General Templinsky. I've discussed him before, one of the best Russian commanders of the war. He's the head of the airborne forces. He very, very expertly and skillfully conducted the defense of Kherson region on the east bank of the Dnieper last year, and he is a widely liked and respected commander within the Russian military. More importantly, Templinsky is in very good standing with the Russian Defense Ministry and with Putin himself. So, if he comes to this area and says that he needs more men and machines and equipment to resolve this issue in Krinky, he will get them. And the fact that we're getting more reports of more equipment being sent to the front lines. Rostek has just said that they've supplied another batch of BMP-3s. These are infantry fighting vehicles. Again, you can read all about these vehicles in Jim Kinnair's books. BMP-3s to the Russian military. Well, all that shows that, together with the huge build-up of reserves that's taking place in Russia, that in fact, and contrary to what many people in the West think, the Russians do have the resources they can provide to Templinsky if he asks for them. So, even in this one place where you could say that Ukraine still has some kind of an initiative, they've got 30 men across the Dnieper, hardly, as I said, a huge force, but even there, I suspect they're going to run into problems. Everywhere else, they're coming under increasing pressure from the Russians. And most of the most intense fighting continues to be taking place around Avdeyevka. It's very difficult for me to get a clear sense of exactly what the various movements and counter movements are. But suffice to say that my impression is that in Avdeyevka, the Russians are not only advancing, but are advancing all the time. It may be slow, incremental, grinding work, but I've seen one map which appears to put them again very close to Berdichi and Stepnoye, these two villages to the west of Avdeyevka, which the Russians have looked like they might be seeking to capture. There's more reports that they've been pushing the Ukrainians back towards Keramik, pushing the artillery out of range of the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka. And there's also reports, which are also appearing apparently in the German media, that the gap, the funnel through which Ukraine sends men and supplies into Avdeyevka is now just 6 kilometers wide. Now that, by the way, already means that the Russians have every part of this funnel within artillery range, so that sending men and supplies into Avdeyevka must be getting increasingly difficult. Apparently weather conditions are now starting to become drier, which might help the Russians to advance more quickly. It would perhaps also enable the Ukrainians to send supplies to some extent across the fields, not rely on the one asphalted road that they apparently have been using up to this time, which of course must be under constant observation by the Russians, by Russian drones, and which can be raked by Russian artillery. But anyway, it might ease Ukrainian supply problems a little, the fact that the ground is becoming more dry, but it will probably also make it easier for the Russians to carry out advances across country as they have had to do. So, an increasingly grim military situation for the Ukrainians. And going back to that article in Time magazine, which I discussed yesterday, more reports from Ukraine of bitter feuding now between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, and there are now reports that General Zaluzhny himself has had to make clear that some telegram channels which are appearing, which purport to be either backed by him or actually authored by him, have actually nothing to do with him, and that statements, belligerent statements that appear in them ought to be disregarded. And there are suggestions, which are probably true, that these telegram channels are perhaps being deliberately created by General Zaluzhny's political adversaries and conceivably close to Zelensky and his officials. And that Time magazine article spoke about how at least one senior general who was in overall charge of the offensive will have to be sacked as punishment for the offensive's failure, and logically that points to Zaluzhny. I said some weeks ago that it seemed to me that General Zaluzhny was probably on borrowed time, that there'd been a big effort to build up General Tarnavsky, the head of the territorial forces, and he's also the overall commander of Ukrainian troops, apparently in the Zaporozhye front, that there seemed to be some attempts to try to build him up in place of Zaluzhny. Perhaps what's underway is that Zaluzhny is going to be sacked, and Tarnavsky, as I suggested, might be the person who would take over from him, though it is not inconceivable depending on how things turn out, that in fact it will be Zaluzhny who keeps his job and Tarnavsky who will be sacked instead. With these kind of power struggles, nobody can fully predict the outcome. Meanwhile, Alexei Arestovich, who used to be Zelensky's friend and spin doctor, is coming out making increasingly abusive statements about Zelensky, critical statements about Zelensky, talking about things like dictatorship and corruption. And many people believe, and I personally would not be surprised if this were true, that Arestovich himself is making some kind of bid for power, perhaps not so much as president. I have to say, I find the idea of Arestovich as president a fantastic one, but perhaps he's preparing the ground, softening the ground for someone else. Anyway, this is where we are. Now, a couple of days ago, I said that Speaker Johnson seemed to have, House Speaker Johnson seemed to have come round suddenly to funding for Ukraine. Perhaps I spoke too soon. He may have said that in his interview with Hannity, but in his latest moves in Congress, he's taken steps to separate the question of funding for Ukraine from funding for Israel. He's gone along with the proposal that actually was first floated by Speaker McCarthy, the former Speaker, that these two packages ought to be considered separately. And apparently, the groundswell amongst Republicans in Congress against authorizing funding for Ukraine not only remains very strong, but is apparently, if anything, strengthening. And I saw a report that Johnson has actually contacted the White House. Apparently he's done this openly in some form of an open letter or something like that. And he said that before Congress authorizes this extra funding, it does need to be told about what the administration's plan is and how it expects Ukraine to achieve victory. Now, these are impossible questions for the administration to answer, because it's quite clear to me that they have no real plan for victory and no real idea about how this war should evolve. Instead, we're getting comments from people like Lloyd Austin, who are instead saying not that the United States has a plan for victory, but that if Ukraine doesn't get funding, then the Russians will win the victory and Ukraine will be defeated. So he's flipping the whole thing. He's not saying that we have a plan for victory, only that if we don't get the funding, then we will suffer and Ukraine will suffer a defeat, which is a classic example, by the way, of the lost costs fallacy that was discussed some months ago, refuted some months ago by Alex Christoforou, my colleague, on a program he did for the Duran. And of course, we've now had this bizarre suggestion that funding Ukraine actually strengthens the US economy in some ways. It doesn't. That is obviously manifestly wrong. And I have to say, to me, that looks like a desperate argument. So all of the cards are now starting to fall, and they're not falling in a way that favors Ukraine. But so far, no clear plan from anybody about what to do. The latest victim of these Russian hoaxers, who are undoubtedly working for Russian intelligence, by the way, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni of Italy, who's been outspoken in her support of Ukraine. She also apparently told these hoaxers that she realizes that there has to be a negotiation, that the offensive has failed, and that she has some ideas about what that negotiation should look like. But of course, she didn't tell us what those ideas are. She didn't tell the hoaxers what those ideas are, which is perhaps because she doesn't actually have any real ideas. So, complete lack of ideas, complete lack of a plan with respect to Ukraine. I noticed, by the way, that for the first time since the war began, The Guardian this morning on its website, they did have some Ukraine news, but they've usually had a whole sort of line of stories, each, next to the other, giving the impression that, appearing to give large prominence and coverage to the war. Yesterday, there were only 3 stories sitting next to each other. Today, there are none. That whole line today has disappeared. No doubt it will reappear again soon. But anyway, people not talking so much about Ukraine anymore. Middle East conflict taking all the news. Nobody, however, with any ideas about what to do and the conflict going on. Well, there we go. Both these wars, the one in the Middle East, the Ukrainian war, grinding relentlessly towards military solutions, military outcomes. I've discussed in the past that there were options, many ways of preventing the Ukrainian war. That was an easy war to avoid, to prevent. Many options to end it early. Options for diplomatic solutions still exist, but nobody's taking them. So the conflict almost certainly heading towards a military outcome. And I'm afraid to say the same is equally true, or even more true, about the conflict in the Middle East. There we are. That's where we stand. A complete collapse of statesmanship. But that is the reality of the world today. So this is where I end my program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. A lot obviously going on. Perhaps less information coming from either of these theatres of war over the last couple of hours, but we'll be getting an awful lot more information soon. And I suspect before long, renewed diplomatic activity at an intensified pace. So much more to wait for, and I'll be there to cover it and to discuss it. So thank you for joining me again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.